self I am, or am trying to be. Joseph is your whole self, more or less, the image of the sum of your various personalities in the past and future. All this was spelled out so quickly that we could hardly keep our hands on the pointer. Despite myself, I leaned closer. The back of my neck prickled. What was going on? "Can you tell us more?" Rob asked. "If you call me Joseph, what do you call Jane?" "Rupert." We looked at each other again. I grimaced. "Would you clear that up a bit?" Rob asked. "What's to clear?" replied the pointer. "Well, it seems like a strange name to us. I don't think Jane likes it either." Strange to the strange. There was a pause. We didn't know what to ask or how to proceed. Finally, Rob said, "Could you tell me why I had all that back trouble earlier this year?" Vertebrae 1 didn't channel vital force through organism, restrained by fears pinching nerves. Expansion of spirit allows physical organism to expand. Releases pressures. These are only a few excerpts from that first session with Seth. A few weeks later, though, Rob had some more difficulty with his back and went to a chiropractor who told him that his first vertebrae was out of alignment. The session lasted until after midnight, and after that we sat up talking about it. "Maybe he's a part of both our subconscious minds in a way we don't understand," I said. "Maybe," Rob said, then added with a grin, "maybe he actually is someone who survived death." "Oh, hon," I said, rather disgusted. "Besides, what purpose would he have? If there are spirits, they must have better things to do than going around moving Ouija boards." "What did you say, Rupert?" Rob asked. I could have crowned him. Seth had a purpose, all right, to deliver the material he's been giving us twice a week now, like clockwork, for the past 5 years. But we didn't know that then. While this was already our 4th session at the board, it was really our first Seth session. The next 2 were much the same, except for one bewildering element. I began to anticipate the board's replies. This bothered me to no end, and I grew uneasy. At the next session, our 4th with Seth, I heard the words in my head at a faster and faster rate, and not only sentences, but whole paragraphs before they were spelled out. The next session started like the others. I was working afternoon at an art gallery, and after the dishes were done and Rob was through with painting for the day, we got out the board. "Why is Jane rather reserved about our contacts with you?" Rob asked when we were set up. "I can tell she isn't too enthusiastic." "She is concerned because she receives my messages before they are spelled out. It would make you cautious, too." "But why is this cause for concern?" Rob asked, with, I thought, at the time, a marvelously faked innocence. "It is more unsettling." "Why?" Rob persisted. "A board is neutral. Messages in the mind are not." In the meantime, we had told a friend of ours, Bill McDonnell, what we were doing. Bill, in turn, had told us about an apparition he'd seen a few years earlier when he was an art student. He'd never mentioned such a thing before. Now, Rob asked what Bill had seen. A fragment of his own entity. A past personality regaining momentarily independence on visual plane. Sometimes a lapse occurs of this type. Was the image conscious of Bill's presence? I hardly heard Rob ask the question. Through the whole session, I'd been hearing the words in my head before they were spelled out, and I'd felt the impulse to speak them. Now the impulse grew stronger, and I grew more determined to fight it. Yet I was terribly curious. And what could happen after all? I didn't know. and this made me even more curious. The pointer began to spell out the answer to Rob's question. In some submerged manner, all fragments of a personality exist within an entity, with their own individual consciousness. The pointer paused. I felt as if I were standing, shivering, on the top of a high diving board, trying to make myself jump, while all kinds of people were waiting impatiently behind me. Actually, it was the words that pushed at me. They seemed to rush through my mind. In some crazy fashion, I felt as if they'd back up, piles of nouns and verbs in my head, until they closed everything off if I didn't speak them. And, without really knowing how or why, I opened up my mouth and let them out. For the first time, I began to speak for Seth, continuing the sentences the board had spelled out only a moment before. When Bill saw the image and recognized its presence, the fragment itself seemed to have a dream. The entity operates its fragments in what you would call a subconscious manner, that is, without conscious direction. The entity gives the fragment independent life. Then the entity more or less forgets the fragment. When a momentary lapse of control occurs, they both come face to face. It's as impossible for the entity to control fragment personalities as for the conscious mind to control the body's heartbeat. Suddenly, the words stopped. I stared at Rob. "Could you hear yourself?" he asked. I nodded, bewildered. Dimly, as if a radio program was going on in my head from some other station. I paused and put my hands back on the pointer, thinking that I'd had enough of this speaking, or whatever it was, for one night. "Seth, would you verify Jane's reception of the above message?" Rob asked. "Yes, it should make her feel better." I relaxed a little. The pointer was taking over the messages again. But Rob asked another question. "Then it's possible to walk down a street and meet a fragment of yourself?" The pointer began the answer. "Of course. I will try to think of a good analogy to make the point clearer. Even thoughts, for instance, are fragments, though on a different plane." Again, the words were speeding through my head while the little pointer spelled them out slowly and methodically. I remember a terrible impatience, and then I was finishing the message aloud. They have to be translated into physical reality. Fragments of another sort, called personality fragments, operate independently, though under the auspices of the entity. Once more, the words just stopped. This time I was determined not to let the same thing happen again until I had time to think it over. And I told Rob. Still, we agreed to check with the board. "Was Jane's answer right, Seth?" Rob asked. "Yes," replied the pointer. "It perks her up not to have to wait around for the board to spell out the answers." "I'm glad somebody thinks so," I said to Rob. But now that things were safely back with the board, my curiosity was at me again. I told Rob to ask if one of us alone could work the pointer, and the pointer suggested that we try. Rob put his hands on the pointer and asked a question, but it barely moved. Then we both put our hands back on it. "What did you think of that, Seth?" Rob asked. "Not very good. Any contacts on your part will probably include internal visual data. Jane will probably be able to receive me direct. In either case, contact is not possible at all times. You would find this more embarrassing than I would." Rob said. We laughed and finally ended the session. I don't know what Rob would have thought then if he'd realized what Seth meant by internal visual data though, and writing this now, I just remembered that he was pretty surprised when his first few internal visions appeared with extraordinary vividness. I'll describe these later. That night, of course, we were primarily concerned with my speaking experience. If I'd known how this was to be expanded in the next session, I probably would have been a nervous wreck. In fact, the next month waited for us with experiences so startling that we nearly called the whole thing to a halt. Yet we felt light-hearted at the same time. If there was more to this world and reality than we suspected, we certainly wanted to find out. And we still are finding out, for new developments appear in the sessions even now. The Seth material continues, and we still have countless questions we want answered. On December 8th, then, Seth introduced himself. On the 15th, I spoke for him for the first time. Soon, freed completely from the board, his personality began to express itself with much greater freedom. The process is fascinating to watch. For this reason, I'll devote some space to the early sessions so that you can become acquainted with the material as Seth gave it, and see him emerge as a personality in his own right.